Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're tackling one of the most famous stories ever told, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, if you think you know this story inside and out, well, prepare to be surprised. We're about to completely shatter what you think you know and uncover a profound, hidden architecture underneath this classic tale. Let's get right into it.
You know, we all know this famous command, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Over the centuries, the phrase Good Samaritan has literally become part of our everyday language. We name hospitals after it, charities use it, and we toss it around to describe anyone who changes a tire for a stranger on the side of the highway. But here's the secret. That overwhelming familiarity is actually a Trojan horse. It lulls us into a false sense of security, making us think we already get the whole point.
But what if the most famous moral lesson in history isn't actually just a simple lesson about being nice? When we strip this story of its first-century context, it gets routinely flattened out into this generic call to help strangers. But today, we're going to peel back those flattened layers to reveal a mind-blowing, hidden theological architecture that the original audience would have heard loud and clear.
Okay, let's dive into this. Layer 1, the flattened moral lesson.
So the story actually kicks off with a hostile lawyer looking for a loophole. He asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Essentially, he wants to find the exact boundary for his obligations so he knows exactly who he does not have to love. To answer his trap, Jesus sets the scene. And the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, it wasn't some mythical pathway. It was a terrifyingly real 17-mile route that dropped 2,500 feet in elevation. It wound through this rocky terrain that was absolutely perfect for bandit ambushes. It was so notoriously dangerous, it was actually known as the Way of Blood.
The victim in the story falls among robbers who beat him and, this is absolutely crucial, they strip him. See, in the first century, clothing marked your ethnicity and status. Without it, the victim has no visible identity markers whatsoever. He could be a Jew, a Gentile, a slave. He is reduced to one single identity, pure need. Then, the religious elites, a priest and a Levite, pass by. Now, it's often taught that they avoided him because of ritual purity laws, but that actually doesn't hold up historically. They ignored him out of sheer callousness. It was a profound failure of the very tradition they represented. At this point, the original audience is practically holding their breath, bracing for a predictable Israelite hero to arrive and save the day.
Layer 2, the shocking Samaritan substructure.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that instead of an expected Israelite hero, Jesus introduces a Samaritan as the third person in the story. To the first-century listener, breaking that expected pattern of priest, Levite, Israelite was a deeply offensive theological provocation. Our modern view is that a Samaritan is just, a friendly stranger or an outsider who helps. But the first-century view? No way. A Samaritan was a schismatic, heretical kinsman. They weren't totally foreign pagans, they were relatives who worshipped the same God but did it all wrong from the Judean perspective. Their very existence was a painful reminder of theological catastrophe and ancient betrayal.
There were centuries of boiling ethnic warfare behind this. In 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern tribes and mixed the populations, creating the ancestors of the Samaritans. When the southern tribes returned cleanly from their own exile later on, that split deepened. They had rival temples. It got so bad that a Jewish ruler actually destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim in 128 BC. The hostility was fierce, it was sustained, and it was religiously charged. To call a Samaritan your neighbor was frankly absolutely unthinkable.
Which brings us to layer 3, the hidden word mouth.
This is where we get to do some literary detective work, which I absolutely love. Luke threads a very specific Greek vocabulary word deliberately through his gospel. Lēstēs. Now, this doesn't just mean a petty thief or a mugger. It means a violent brigand, an insurgent, or a political rebel who uses force against imperial order. These aren't just anonymous street thugs. In Luke's narrative code, this word carries massive theological freight.
Tracing this lēstēs word chain reveals it appears exactly 3 times in carefully placed contexts in Luke's gospel. First, Jesus cleanses the temple and accuses the religious establishment of being a den of lēstēs, robbers. Second, right here in our parable, the attackers on the road to Jericho are lēstēs. And third, during Jesus' arrest in the garden, he asks the crowd of priests and elders, "Have you come out as against the lēstēs with swords?" Do you see it? The parable is secretly a forward-loaded indictment scene. The temple elites are the actual robbers.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that the narrative perfectly align. The parable forecasts Jesus' arrest. Jesus is the man left half dead to the robbers. The temple elites are the attackers. And in the garden, when the disciples pull swords and then flee, well, they failed the exact test the parable set up. They failed to stay and act as neighbors to the man left among the robbers.
And this brilliantly illustrates layer 4, the cosmic reversal.
We're diving into the deep theological frameworks fighting in the background of this story regarding the origins of violence. In the first century, there were two competing frameworks of power. The first comes from Jewish apocalyptic literature, like First Enoch, involving the Watchers, these fallen sons of God who brought the sword and violence into the world. In this view, the kingdom of the world advances through domination. But fighting against this is the framework of Isaiah 53's suffering servant, a righteous figure who doesn't use the sword, but instead bears transgressions, absorbs the cost of violence, and heals his enemies.
The disciples failed the test in the garden by reaching for the weapons of the Watchers, the swords. But the Samaritan in our parable, he embodies the suffering servant. He doesn't take up arms, he absorbs the cost, he surrenders his own resources, and he heals his historical enemy. The Samaritan acts as the ultimate subversive figure, demonstrating that the kingdom of God advances entirely through mercy, not violence.
To really put that into perspective, look at the sheer excessive compassion on display here. The Samaritan leaves 2 denarii for the innkeeper. Given the economy of the time, that covers roughly 3 weeks of care. He puts his own body at risk by walking while the wounded man rides, and he puts his own financial future on the line. This is mind-boggling compassion that totally shatters the expectations of the hostile lawyer listening to the story.
Layer 5, reclaiming surrendered geography.
This brings us to our final, mind-blowing reveal. Based on the framework found in Deuteronomy 32, the ancient worldview held that the nations were divided among spiritual powers. Because of the ancient northern kingdom's apostasy, the land of Samaria was considered apostate territory. From a Judean perspective, it was territory that had been spiritually surrendered to darker powers. That made the Samaritan the ultimate outsider, carrying all the baggage of surrendered spiritual land.
The steps of the mission in the book of Acts directly echo this. The early church is told to go to Jerusalem, then directly to Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. The parable of the Good Samaritan wasn't just a nice little moral story, it was a direct forecast of the early church's mission. They were meant to cross boundaries, dissolve the old lines, and bring the gospel into spiritually surrendered, contested lands. The outsider was going to be brought inside.
At the end of the parable, Jesus asked the lawyer who the neighbor was. His response? The one who showed him mercy. The lawyer's bitter reluctance is deafening. He literally cannot even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. But his answer proves the story worked. It successfully dismantled his attempt to draw nice, neat boundaries around his love and his obligations.
Which leaves us with Jesus' final grammatical reframe. Which of these 3 proved to be a neighbor? The lawyer asked who qualified to be loved. Jesus totally flips it. The moral question isn't about identifying who qualifies for our love. The question is whether we are willing to step out, absorb the cost, and become the kind of person who loves the one in need on the contested roads of our own lives. So what about you? Are you willing to become the neighbor?